Now we have my friend Richard Thomas. Richard Thomas is George Martin Lane Professor of Classics at Harvard University. Born in London and brought up in Auckland, New Zealand, he did his Ph.D. at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Since 1977, he's taught on ancient Greek and Roman literature and on the reception of classic literature in the last 2 millennia, including in the works of Dante, Milton, and Bob Dylan, on whom he has taught a freshman seminar every 4 years since 2004. He has written several books and more than 100 articles on classical subjects and is the author of a book I think many of us in this room have read, Why Bob Dylan Matters, which came out in 2017. And now I'm going to read his quote. What Dylan means to me. I'm into my 6th decade with Dylan as my guide and bard together through life. He is the Homer, Virgil, Dante, the Blake, Picasso, Eliot of our age. Richard, thank you.
That's here. There we go. Thank you, Enrique. Thank you, Rebecca, for that introduction. And it's one of the wonderful things about working on Bob Dylan, which I've been doing really since Dylan started channeling classical authors. He did that in 1978 and a bit in the song Changing of the Guards, but really started doing it consciously in 2001, and that's why the freshman seminar began in 2004. Before that, I'd been a fan and I'd been a classicist as 2 separate enterprises, but really in the 1980s and 90s, I started seeing Dylan really in the same way that I saw those authors that were up there, the authors that I work on. And part of my curiosity is whether, I won't be around to see it, but whether 50 years from now Dylan will still be around, and I believe he will. And I think that is what makes him a classic. I'm going to talk in April about what is a classic, going back to the essay by T.S. Eliot in 1947, which said one can't define a classic without including Virgil's Aeneid, the great Roman epic, and so he defines what is a classic through that poem. I'm going to do the same thing, but with Dylan, who is for me as Virgil was for Eliot, and as Virgil also is for me. So the great thing about doing this work is that I get to meet people like those of you in this room. We met, I think, 3 or 4 years ago through the Tulsa Archive and just through going to Dylan concerts. So I was at the same concert in New York. I got to 2 New York ones. I got to one in Pittsburgh on the way down here 2 weeks ago. And he saved me the trouble of traveling by coming to Boston this past Saturday. So I saw him there. He's in Philadelphia last night and tonight, and then ends up in Washington, D.C. So one gets to meet people. And my 3 years ago, almost, I think I had an email from somebody who said, I'm involved in a big Dylan project. I wonder if you might be interested. And I occasionally get emails like that. And I thought, yeah, sure you are. And, it turned out to be one Shai Beitel who I first emailed Jeff Rosen and said, is this guy okay? Because Jeff Rosen, Dylan's manager, would say, no, stay well away from him, if he wasn't okay, as he's occasionally said. But anyway, that was the beginning of a wonderful collaboration. That the climax was yesterday when I actually met Shai for the first time, because I was involved in an essay that we worked on for the Retrospectrum in Shanghai, and then, but we didn't meet in Shanghai. We weren't there at quite the same time, but then met yesterday with this wonderful collection. And then meeting the governor and the ambassador today, and of course meeting Rebecca Friedman and Heiko and Miller every Thursday morning at 10:30 Eastern Time. We met for the last, I think, 6 months to be working on this. So that's been wonderful. So I could also talk about my early Dylan encounters in New Zealand, and We got Bonanza. We also got I Love Lucy. Those are our two shows. I see a look of puzzlement on the faces of the younger people, but I Love Lucy, Lucille Ball. And I had to go 2 doors down to see them because we didn't actually have a television set. And likewise, it was only in the evening, I think, for 3 hours. So when I was 13, I'm 9 years younger than Dylan, so I sort of followed him pretty much throughout my life from my teenage years. And when I was 14, I think it was, my school choir did Blowing in the Wind. I thought that was a Peter, Paul and Mary song because that was a version that was on the radio. Dylan wasn't put on the radio that much, and he didn't care, which is why he didn't do 3-minute songs. You had to do 3-minute songs to get on the radio. Dylan's art is what drove him, not the sort of the commercial enterprise. So we sang Blowing in the Wind, and that was the year after the March on Washington. So that was very much in my consciousness, that march. We didn't see it on television, but I read about it. And of course, the years that followed, so that the hope of those years that was dashed by the assassinations of Martin, Malcolm, by the uprisings in American cities. I didn't come here till 1974, but again, read about them. But the hope of Mexico City, and I still remember the black fist raised in 1968 at the Mexico Olympics, and that's if you're on the Mall in Washington, you can visit the Museum of African American History, which has a wonderful sculpture of that event. So that was, I actually had an afro in those years. My hair is now somewhat relaxed, but I had my afro pick was a plastic afro pick, and the handle was a black handle. I think I got in 1970, so 2 years after that. So Dylan has been the voice of everything that's mattered in terms of, it was wonderful to hear the governor and the ambassador just so eloquently talk about the relevance to people in Israel, New Zealand, New Jersey, wherever, has been wonderful. And this picture that you see here, this is I did the essay for the catalog on deep focus. I didn't talk about this image, but this image is from the 1971 film Shaft, which is John Shaft, who's a black private eye. Noir, again, comes in, I think, in that movie. Now, it was not going to be a black actor. It was going to be a white actor, but that was changed at the last minute. And that is one of the first of the blaxploitation movies of the late 60s and early 70s. Very important movie. And the figure of John Shaft, it's now sort of dated a bit in terms of he's not exactly a feminist, shall we say, which is also a wonderful line in the film Masked and Anonymous, where this figure, I guess you could call me a feminist, so this character who's clearly anything but a feminist. And that's Dylan in 2003, again, refusing to go along with the times. So this scene is in Harlem, just where the Harlem line comes above ground on Park Avenue, and Dylan has manipulated this. Shaft is actually in the frame here, but he takes him out, and this is called Cold Day, so that's this isolated figure. And you'll see, if you haven't already in the collection, the isolation of human beings, I think, is one of the themes that Dylan creates, these figures like us who are at the end of the day alone, but whose contact with other humans on our journey is what it's all about. So I'm going to talk about really a sequel to my book, Why Bob Dylan Matters, which is about the ways in which Dylan channels, uses, manipulates classical authors, which is not all Dylan does, so it's a small part of what Dylan does. And I'm going to really be looking at the Rough and Rowdy Ways in particular, which came out after I wrote my book. So here are a couple of my early reviews of my book, which in the Times of London and in The Guardian. So it was not exactly a joy when these were sent to me, but James Marriott yawns at my nerdy analysis, and Sean thinks I'm an academic attempting to shoehorn Dylan into the pantheon of literary greats, and I misunderstand the singer's appeal by doing that. Sean didn't speak to somebody else at The Guardian who decided my book should be The Guardian, an independent music book of the year. So I preferred that designation to the previous one. But so Sean also noted that Thomas also cites a relatively minor Dylan song, When I Paint My Masterpiece, as further evidence of Dylan's love of and identification with Rome. One can only wonder what the singer's poetic predecessors would have made of lines as throwaway as the opening verse, "Oh, the streets of Rome are filled with rubble, ancient footprints are everywhere. You can almost think that you're seeing double on a cold, dark night on the Spanish stairs." Now, Sean couldn't hear the poetry of that, just as reading it out. Ovid it ain't, he says. Ovid is one of the poets I talk about that Dylan channels, particularly that, and Robert and I have both written on that in the album, 2006 album. So Dylan hadn't, when that review came out, Dylan hadn't played When I Paint My Masterpiece since 2011. And I don't think it's because of that review and because Bob was standing by me, but Dylan then proceeded a few months later, in July 27, 2008, to put the song into his set list, and he's played it on every concert since, 108 performances since that time, and including last night and tonight he will sing it. We know he'll sing it tonight. So anyway, and then he was, right before Rough and Rowdy Ways came out, he was interviewed by Douglas Brinkley, who will be joining us in April, for the historian, American historian at Rice University, but who's also a Dylan expert and is, I think, a friend of Dylan, so he says he is, so we take him at his word, but who's interviewed Dylan, so, and Dylan decides when he wants to be interviewed and who's going to interview him, so he keeps control of that. So Brinkley brings up When I Paint My Masterpiece, and again, I wonder whether Brinkley thought of that or whether Dylan said, "Why don't you ask me about When I Paint My Masterpiece?" But anyway, we'll never know. And Dylan says, "I think this song has something to do with the classical world, something that's out of reach, someplace you'd like to be beyond your experience, something that is so supreme and first rate that you could never come back down from the mountain, that you've achieved the unthinkable." That's what the song tries to say, and you'd have to put it in that context. Again, Dylan as a writer is just a writer of English prose, is, as anyone who's read Chronicles knows, is just an astonishing figure. So anyway, then here's the Streets of Rome, and we'll play just a little bit. This is what he's playing. He completely rearranged the song for Shadow Kingdom. They live-streamed but lip-synced film that he put out in the summer. But here I'll just play one verse of the 1971 version, which wasn't put out on an album, came out on a Greatest Hits album, but it's not a relatively minor Dylan song. Dylan, by the way, his first song about Rome was in 1962 when he he was in London for the first time. He was out of the country for the first time in December 62. And he made a trip to Rome from London. And he got back, and in Gerde's folk center in New York City, he sang the song, "I'm going back to Rome, that's where I was born." And I talk about that in my book. So I was born, what's Dylan saying? That's where I was born. He was born in Duluth or Hibbing or wherever. He wasn't, no, he was born in Rome because he saw 50s Rome movies when Hollywood, to avoid McCarthyist sort of hounding, basically used ancient Rome as a metaphor. And so Rome versus the Christians was essentially the Republicans versus the left of, many of the left as Jewish Hollywood producers, actors, and so on. So Dylan's uncle owned the cinema in Hibbing, and Dylan saw all of these movies, and he talks a bit about that in Chronicles. But anyway, here's a bit of the song. And right back then, Dylan was also rewriting songs, of course, Where I Got Me a Date with Botticelli's Niece, and the other version, or Where I Got Me a Date with the Pretty Little Young Girl from Greece. And now, tonight, he will sing Gotta Hurry On Back to My Hotel Room with his aging blues song. It's a song that's completely transformed. It's not a 20-year-old song. It's a song that fits Dylan now, but it's the same song, but particularly with the change where wash off my clothes and scrape off all of the grease. So he's a busboy in a hotel or something. I'm gonna lock myself away for a while, gonna paint my masterpiece. So there's a sadness there and a life that's basically in the gutter more or less, but still wanting to write his masterpiece. And so in the 2020 Brinkley interview, the song's still alive, but it's the same song, but it's a different song. And only Dylan does that. Only Dylan can basically recreate this world. So just a quick word on Dylan as Odysseus. Again, this is from the previous book, but I'm not going to read through all of this. But if you haven't heard, and I don't mean read, I mean heard Dylan's Nobel lecture from June 7th, June 2017, I knew that he would do a lecture because to get the $900,000 prize for the Nobel, he had to get his lecture in 6 months. And my editor gave me an extra week because I knew that he would be getting it in, which he did just under the wire. And I had written about Dylan on the basis of the songs, the Dylan character becoming Odysseus simply by Dylan's taking several lines, not from the Odyssey, but from Odysseus' speeches in the Odyssey, a specific The Penguin translation by Fagles, absolute word for word, undeniable. So that in the process, I argued that he therefore becomes Odysseus. And I'll just read a bit, the end of the first paragraph there. He's been gone 20 years. He was carried off somewhere and left there. Drugs have been dropped into his wine. It's been a hard road to travel. In a lot of ways, some of these same things have happened to you. You too have had drugs dropped into your wine. You too have shared a bed with the wrong woman. Several of them probably. But there, Dylan is actually telling us in his Nobel lecture that, yes, I became Odysseus. So I was very, very pleased to get confirmation from Bob of that. But anyway, so Rough and Rowdy Ways in 2020. And just out of curiosity, who has listened to the album? So if Dylan, a good smattering, but what's that?
Murder Most Foul.
Murder Most Foul, yeah. And these were released, of course, earlier in 2020. This was a wonderful sort of, I think Dylan, the world was suffering from COVID, and I think Dylan, the humanity of Dylan, the virtue of Dylan, the morality, I think he gave us these songs to help us. Now, you might wonder, how could Murder Most Foul, an 18-minute song on the death of JFK, help us? But it does, because it's also, he's listing, Play Me, Wolfman Jack, the DJ of Dylan's youth, Play Me, and then these songs from the 60s and songs from Dylan's and our youth. And then he released a couple of others. I Contain Multitudes and False Prophet. At midnight, California time, Malibu time, over the ensuing months, and then the album came out. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of songs, but really there's a classical presence on all of them, along with other writers. Robert listed some of them, Poe and Whitman in particular, with I Contain Multitudes. But the songs, obviously Crossing the Rubicon, which along with Murder Most Foul is the one song he isn't singing on tour. He's doing the other 8. But I was sort of hoping at Boston he would sing Crossing the Rubicon in honor of me, but it didn't happen. So I was greatly disappointed. But Mother of Muses is going to connect back to the Nobel lecture in interesting ways. So here's, and I'm not going to go through this or play it for you again in the interest of time, but crossing the Rubicon, and you can look at, basically the Rubicon, the river that separated Julius Caesar's official area of military activity from the rest, so the area that was voted to him by the Republican Senate. And in crossing the Rubicon, he basically brings down a republic and creates an autocracy. Think about that. Think about January 6th and think about that. And the peril is, that's why I give you a republic if you can keep it, because these were readers of Roman history, not Athenian democracy, but the fall of the Roman Republic. And the bottom right there, Dylan in 2015, if I had to do it all over again, I'd be a school teacher, probably teach Roman history or theology. Now, Dylan is a notoriously unreliable narrator, but I choose to find him reliable when the quotes are in the interest of the arguments I'm making. But crossing the Rubicon, so the voice is the voice of Julius Caesar, but it's also the voice of Dante. I abandoned all hope, and I crossed the Rubicon. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here from the Inferno. There's also, the Rubicon is a red river going gently as she goes, redder than your ruby lips. And Rubicon is from the Latin rubao, to be red or to be blushing. It's partly from the red pebbles that are in there from the volcanic soil of that river. So does Dylan did Latin, as we know, for a couple of years in high school, though I don't think he knows Latin now. But so there's Caesar there, but there's also Christ. I poured the cup and I passed it along. I crossed the Rubicon. So may I pass this cup if you wished, but he doesn't pass the cup, of course. But I feel the Holy Spirit inside and light that freedom gives. I believe it's within the reach of every man who lives, and so on. But anyway, and then Mona Baby. Who's Mona? Is that the Ramona, as in Ramona, come closer? Who knows? And this incongruity, I think that Dylan learned very early on from French surrealism to combine things which are not combinable logically or rationally, but Dylan's art combines them and creates something that's completely new. It's greater than the sum of its parts, as we say. Well, here's just a bit of the song. Yeah, so just the voice, the performance. I've been talking about words, but of course it's about the whole package, the brand, as the ambassador said, and brand, is also tied up with classic. What is a classic? The 18th century term classic is related to the 18th century term class. So a classic is the best of something. A slightly controversial concept these days, but not for a classicist like myself. Many classics departments are changing their names to run away from the word, but I'm quite happy with it. But anyway, so here's the Nobel medal, and here the permanent secretary of the Swedish Academy, Sarah Danius, who unfortunately is now deceased, so she was not that permanent. But she, in her blog, described Dylan was playing in Stockholm that morning in April 1st and 2nd, 2017, and so he dropped by the Swedish Academy to pick up his medal. He didn't have contempt for the Academy, by the way. When it was announced, same day that I was teaching my freshman seminar, he was on the road. He was on tour. He was living in a bus, and it's a complete misunderstanding, like many of Dylan, that he somehow had contempt for this and was rude and didn't care. He obviously cared very deeply. But anyway, Sarah Danius and the Dylan people would have said, please don't say what you just said, describes Dylan looking very closely at the medal. And I think the other side is just Mr. Nobel, not a very interesting side. But this side, from a 1901 engraver, is a young man sitting under a tree writing something with a papyrus box behind him with spare papyri. And there's a muse in front of him with a kithara zither guitar is all the same word. Basically, the kithara is a 7-string rather than 6 or 12. But basically, we have no Nobel recipient is described better by the medal that they all got than Bob Dylan is. So, yes, he did deserve that. And Dylan must have looked at this and thought, holy, that's me. And this is basically from Virgil's first eclogue, again, shepherd songs, so shepherds sort of singing, which then get stylized in Virgil, the great poet of Rome, his first collection, the eclogues. Titere tu patulai recuban sub tegmena fagi, titterus, you beneath the tree sit there singing your song to Amaryllis, his girlfriend Amaryllis. So this is Tityrus, that scene's from Virgil, and there we get the muse. So we'll get back to her in a minute. But just around the border is the Latin from Virgil's 6th Aeneid, where Virgil is in the underworld. Dante couldn't have written the Inferno without Virgil's 6th book of Virgil's Aeneid, where Aeneas goes down and hears about the future of Rome from the ghost of his father. And in the underworld, in Elysium, which is the reserved, good place you want to be in the underworld, unlike Tartarus, in Elysium are, among other people, the poets of antiquity, Orpheus, Musaeus, those who enriched our lives with the newfound arts they forged, and those we remember well for the good they did mankind. So that's what the Nobel Medal for Literature says. And Dylan, in My Own Version of You, which is a song which is basically about Frankenstein, but it's all the components of Dylan's art. So My Own Version of You is, the you is a Frankenstein figure, but it's really about Dylan's art. And here he has that line, I want to do things for the benefit of mankind, that's on the medal, but he also has a scene from book 2 of the Aeneid. Nearby an ancient cypress stands, Trojan boys and trembling women stand in a long line. A single cypress tree and Trojan boys and women doesn't come from Homer, any other author. It's just from Virgil's 2nd book of the Aeneid, which describes the fall of Troy. It's the longest account we have, Trojan horse, all of that stuff. So Dylan's there telling you where he's taking things from. I mean, a lot of people say, yeah, Dylan, it's really old, and they think 19th century or 1920s, but Dylan is here saying, no, keep going further back. So Mother of Muses, here it is, a beautiful song, one of the quieter songs on the album, along with Key West, and I've made up my mind to give myself to you, which is just a stunningly beautiful song. If you hear nothing else, listen to those two, which he's, again, doing in concert. But let's just keep going because time is running out. But I want to just look at the verse by verse, starting with verses 2 to 3. So, Mother of Muses, sing for my heart, sing for love too soon to sing of the heroes who stood alone. And he's sort of been there before, back in 1963, and the names of the heroes I was made to memorize with guns in their hands and God on their side. There's sort of irony about patriotism, basically. Patriotism is really, that this 21-year-old, 22-year-old understood that in such a fundamental way in that song. But anyway, he comes back to it now. Homer's Iliad, this is the beginning of the catalogue of the Greek ships that came to Troy, where the poet says, tell me now, Muses, you who have your homes on Olympus, and so on. And in Virgil's Aeneid 7, tell me, Muses, goddesses, Muses, same thing, with what heroes mothering Italy then flowered. And Dylan has taken this and put it in the context of American history. So Montgomery, we don't know which Montgomery. There's a Civil War Montgomery, but there's also the English Montgomery of El Alamein and North African and Italian campaigns in the Second World War. Another verse, so verse 1, sing of the mountains and the deep dark sea, sing of the lakes and the nymphs of the forest, sing your hearts out, all you women of the chorus. I'm going to play this song after I've just taken you through these things. But again, back to the Nobel lecture. The last words of the Nobel lecture are, I return once again to Homer, 2017. Sing in me, O Muse, and through me tell the story. So he then goes out and writes Mother of Muses and puts it on to the next album that he's about to do. Now, there's a wonderful, halfway through the song changes to, I'm falling in love with Calliope. She don't belong to anybody. Why not give her to me? She's speaking to me, speaking with her eyes. I've grown so tired of chasing lies. Mother of Muses, wherever you are, I've already outlived my life by far, which the line that Robert mentioned. And I think what Dylan's done here is basically put himself into the figure on the right, the poet, and he's identified Calliope, one of the 7 muses, but she's the muse of epic, so that's appropriate. But and he's basically put this image into the song. Then also, I mean, one thing that has come up today is the virtue of Dylan. I don't mean that in a moralistic or moralizing way, but I think he's a man of deep virtue. He cares, he has values. How do we know that? We don't, but I just don't believe these songs, in particular, these paintings could be produced by somebody who isn't. But here, he prays for what? Show me your wisdom, tell me my fate, put me upright, make me walk straight. And in that same interview with Brinkley, he again talks about, I try to go on a straight line and stay on it, stay on the level. And in Nobel lecture, he talks about the books that he read that gave him an understanding of human nature, a standard to measure things by. So, and then he ends the song with, I think he's channeling Cavafy's Ithaca, the great poem, Constantine Cavafy, who says, keep Ithaca always in mind, arriving there, that is Ithaca, the homeland of Odysseus, to which he spends 20 years getting back. But don't be in a hurry. Don't hurry the journey at all. Better if it lasts many years. So that for this poem, the journey is life. Ithaca is home, being called home, this black spiritual theme that runs throughout a lot of sort of gospel singing. And I think Dylan here got a mind to ramble, got a mind to roam. I'm traveling light and I'm slow coming home. And you can hear, there's a wonderful version from last night in Philadelphia. These bootleggers get the songs up on YouTube before midnight. The performances end around 9:40, and you can get that version on YouTube. I'm not encouraging you to download it or anything, but Key West is the last album, except for Murder Most Foul. And again, this the notion that Key West is a place that is no place, but that it is also, I think, connected with Elysium. And Plato talks about the two places, so we're basically heaven and hell, the Judeo-Christian notions that also have, in the Greco-Roman sense, analogues. Obviously, the human mind creates a good place that you can go to and a bad place that you can go to. And Virgil, again, the same Aeneid 6, the regions to the left punish the wicked for their misdeeds, but the road to the right led to the Elysian fields, and you can see that first, that stay to the left, and then you lean to the right, so that, and you can see again in the Aeneid 6, the fields of joy were next, the sweet green grove held by the fortunate homes of the blessed. The fields were bathed in dazzling light by skies wider than ours and a different sun and stars. Yeah, and so let me end then with the Brinkley review again. That's when I paint my masterpiece, I think the song has something to do with the classical world and so on. So after, that's 2020, after the 2017 responses to the notion that the classical world matters to Dylan, he's put himself in that tradition. So as I say, in April, I will pick up from this and talk about Dylan as classic, but I hope I see part of my mission as persuading classicists that Dylan is important, and Dylan people that classics are important. And if I've partially succeeded with you, then I'm very happy. So thank you.